I have sat across from thousands of families in this studio, and I always say that you cannot change what you do not acknowledge. But there is another truth that often gets buried under the shouting and the finger pointing, and that is the reality that sometimes the person screaming the loudest about being the victim is actually the one holding the smoking gun. When I first heard about this case, it seemed like a slam dunk, the kind of open and shut tragedy I have seen 100 times before. You have a 40-year-old man, a grown adult by any definition, who is still living under his parents' roof, eating their food, burning their electricity, and then, to add insult to injury, he cleans out their safe. On paper, it looks like a classic failure to launch, a case of entitlement run amok, where you have a toxic parasite draining the life out of two well-meaning elderly parents. That was the narrative everyone around them bought. That was the story the neighbors told, the story the police report implied, and frankly, it was the story my own producers briefed me on before I ever walked out onto that stage. But I have learned a long time ago not to judge a book by its cover, and certainly not to judge a guest by their rap sheet until I have looked them in the eye. Because sometimes, when you peel back the layers of dysfunction, you find that the bad guy is the only one telling the truth, and he has been screaming into a void for so long that he has lost his voice. The man in the hot seat was Michael. He was 40 years old, but if you looked at him from a distance, you would think he was a teenager who had just been grounded. He walked with a slump, his eyes darting around the studio like a trapped animal, wearing clothes that looked slightly too big for him, as if he had shrunk inside them. He didn't look like a master criminal, he looked defeated. On the other side of the stage sat Robert and Linda. They were the picture of respectable, upper-middle-class retirement. Robert wore a crisp blazer, Linda had her hair done perfectly, and they held hands with a dignified stoicism that commanded sympathy. They were the grieving parents, the martyrs who had given everything to a son who threw it back in their faces. The accusation was specific and damning. Michael had cracked their home safe and taken $20,000 in cash and heirloom jewelry, then disappeared for 3 days. When he came back, the money was gone. To anyone watching, Michael was a thief and a scoundrel. But as I watched the monitor backstage before the show began, I saw something that made me pause. I saw Robert lean over to Michael during the commercial break and whisper something, and I saw a 40-year-old man flinch, not in anger, but in sheer, unadulterated fear. That is when I knew we weren't dealing with a simple theft. We were dealing with a power dynamic that had been rotting for decades. I started the show the way I always do, by getting the facts on the table. I looked at Robert and asked him to walk me through the incident. He was articulate, calm, and precise. He had a spreadsheet, literally, a printed Excel spreadsheet listing everything Michael had ever stolen or destroyed since 1998. He talked about the $20,000 as the straw that broke the camel's back. He said they had been saving that money for a renovation, and that Michael knew exactly where the key was because they trusted him. They had given him a roof over his head when he lost his last job. They had paid for his car insurance. They had bailed him out of debt. And this was the thanks they got. The audience was on their side immediately. You could feel the energy in the room shifting against Michael. People don't like ungrateful children, and they really don't like elder abuse. When I turned to Michael, he was shaking. He wasn't defensive in the way guilty people usually are, puffing up their chest, deflecting blame. He was just muttering almost to himself. He said, "I took it. I admit I took it." Now, usually, when a guest confesses in the first 5 minutes, we think the work is done. But I looked at him and I asked, "Why, Michael? Why did you take the money?" And he looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed, and said the thing that nobody had listened to for 20 years. He said, because it was the only way I could leave. They wouldn't let me leave. The audience laughed. A few people actually chuckled. A 40-year-old man claiming his mommy and daddy wouldn't let him move out? It sounded absurd. It sounded like the excuse of a man-child who wanted to blame his failures on everyone else. But I didn't laugh. I leaned in. I asked him what he meant. He told me that every time he tried to get a job, his father would call the employer and check in, often revealing personal medical details or creating drama until Michael was let go. He told me that every time he saved money, suddenly there was a family emergency or a debt his parents claimed he owed them from childhood room and board, braces from $1,995, and they would guilt him into handing it over. He claimed that the $20,000 wasn't for drugs or a bender. He said he used it to put a deposit on an apartment in a different state and prepay 6 months of rent so they couldn't find him. Robert and Linda sat there shaking their heads with these sad, pitying smiles. Linda reached over and patted Michael's arm, a gesture that looked affectionate but made Michael recoil. She told me, "Doctor, Phil, Michael has a very active imagination. He's never been able to hold down a job because he lacks discipline. We only call his employers to ensure he's being treated fairly. We only manage his money because he spends it foolishly. We are trying to protect him." It was a seamless performance. It was gaslighting in its purest form, but delivered with the sweetness of a grandmother offering you a cookie. But here's the thing about me. I am a behaviorist. I look at patterns, and the pattern here didn't make sense. If Michael was such a loose cannon, why did they keep him in the house? If he was a thief, why did they show me a text message history where they begged him to come back home every time he tried to stay with a friend? I decided to dig into this protection narrative. I asked Robert about the bank accounts. It turned out Michael didn't have his own bank account. At 40 years old, his name was on a joint account with Robert, and Robert controlled the PIN code. Every cent Michael earned from the odd jobs he managed to keep went into that funnel. When I pointed out that this was financial abuse, Robert didn't flinch. He said, "It's stewardship. Michael isn't competent." I asked for proof of his incompetence. I asked for medical records, court orders, anything that declared this man mentally unfit to manage $5. They had nothing, just their word, just their narrative that he was slow or troubled. But when I spoke to Michael, I didn't hear slow. I heard broken. I heard a man who had been told he was worthless so many times that he believed it. Yet he still had this spark of survival instinct that drove him to do the one thing that would force a separation: commit a crime against them. See, stealing that money was a nuclear option. In Michael's mind, he wasn't stealing, he was severing the umbilical cord with a machete. He knew if he took that money, they would have to call the police or they would have to kick him out. It was a desperate bid for freedom disguised as a felony. But the parents were smarter than that. They didn't call the police immediately, they called me, and that right there was the tell. If someone robs you blind, you call 911. You don't call a television show to get them help unless you are trying to control the narrative on a national stage. They wanted to humiliate him into submission. They wanted the world to validate their sainthood and confirm Michael's villainy so that he would have nowhere else to go. They were building a prison out of public opinion. I looked at the dossier my team had put together. We had dug a little deeper than usual because something smelled off. We found a former employer of Michael's, a manager at a hardware store from 3 years ago. We got him on the phone during the break. He told a very different story than Robert did. He said Michael was a hard worker, quiet, kept to himself. But he said Robert would show up at the store 3 times a week, standing in the aisle, watching Michael work. He said Robert would call the store manager to complain if Michael was 2 minutes late. The manager said he didn't fire Michael because he was a bad worker. He fired him because the father was a liability and was harassing the staff. When I read that transcript, the air in the room changed. I saw Robert's jaw tighten. The mask slipped just for a fraction of a second, and underneath that benevolent father figure, I saw a warden who had just realized the inmates were rioting. We were barely 20 minutes into the taping, and I realized we had to completely flip the script. This wasn't a show about a thief. This was a show about a hostage situation. I turned to the audience, who were still confused, wavering between their initial disgust at the theft and this new information. I knew I had to escalate this. I had to push Robert and Linda until the real dynamic revealed itself. You can't just tell people they are controlling. You have to let them show you. So I decided to focus on the money. I asked Michael where the rest of the cash was, the money he hadn't spent on the apartment deposit. He said he had hidden it. He said he kept it as a freedom fund. Robert interrupted, his voice raising for the first time, demanding to know where the cash was, claiming it was his money. And that is when I knew I had him. I looked at Robert and I saw the veins in his neck bulging just slightly. It was a micro expression of rage that he was trying desperately to suppress because he knew the red light on that camera was still on. He wasn't angry that his son was a thief. He was angry that his property had been misplaced. And make no mistake, in Robert's world, Michael was property. I leaned forward in my chair, resting my elbows on my knees, and I leveled my gaze at the father. I told him to take a breath. I told him that right now, the location of the currency was the least of his problems. I said, Robert, you are talking about this money like it is a business transaction gone wrong, but we are talking about your flesh and blood sitting 2 feet away from you, shaking like a leaf. Does that not register with you? He straightened his blazer, regaining that composure, that icy exterior. He told me that he loved his son, but love required accountability. He said he was trying to teach Michael a lesson about responsibility. That word responsibility kept coming up. It was their shield. They hid all their control behind the guise of teaching him to be a man. So I decided to test that theory. I asked my producers to put up the graphic of the ledger Robert had provided to us. Now, usually, when parents say they have kept track of what their adult children owe them, it's big ticket items, a car down payment, college tuition, maybe a bail bond. But when that graphic hit the big screen behind me, a collective gasp went through the studio audience. It was meticulous. It was pathological. There were entries from 1,998 for broken window, baseball. There was an entry for orthodontia, copay. There were charges for gas money for driving Michael to job interviews 3 years ago, calculated with the mileage rate. And at the bottom, there was a running total with interest. I turned to the audience and I said, you folks tell me, is this parenting or is this a loan shark operation? The crowd murmured, their sympathy for the victimized elderly parents evaporating with every line item on that screen. I turned back to Michael. He wasn't looking at the screen, he was looking at his shoes. I asked him, Michael, did you know about this list? He nodded. He told me that every week on Sunday nights, his father would sit him down for a finance meeting to review the debt. They would remind him how much he cost them, how much of a burden he was. It was a ritual of humiliation designed to keep his self-esteem in the gutter. If he ever talked about moving out, they would pull out the ledger and say, you can't leave until you settle your account. It wouldn't be honorable. They had weaponized his own conscience against him. They raised him to be a good boy, and then they used that goodness to chain him to the radiator. This is what we call a double bind. If Michael stayed, he was a leech. If he tried to leave, he was a thief, skipping out on a debt. There was no winning move except to blow up the board. And that brings me back to the $20,000. I needed to understand the mechanics of the theft because, in my experience, how a crime is committed tells you as much as why Michael didn't break into the safe. He knew the combination because Linda had given it to him years ago. She had asked him to get her earrings one night before a dinner party because her arthritis was acting up. He had the access all along. For 10 years, he could have robbed them blind, but he didn't. Why now? I asked him that. Michael, you had the combination for a decade. Why pull the trigger on this Tuesday? He took a shaky breath and told me about the girl. Her name was Sarah. She was a waitress at the diner where Michael sometimes washed dishes, a job he hadn't told his parents about. He had been stashing his cash tips in a hollowed-out book in his room, not in the joint bank account. Sarah was the first person in his life who didn't look at him like a project or a failure. She saw a sweet, quiet guy who was being crushed. They had made a plan. She was moving to Ohio to be near her sister, and she asked Michael to come. That $20,000 wasn't just for rent, it was his buy-in to a new life. It was his dowry for freedom. But here is where the story gets darker. Robert found the hollowed-out book. He found the cash tips, about $800, 3 days before the theft. He didn't confront Michael. He didn't ask him about it. Instead, he simply took the money and deposited it into the joint account. When Michael came home and found his stash gone, he asked his father about it. Robert told me, right there on stage, with zero shame, I deposited it for safekeeping. I didn't want him spending it on frivolities. I was managing his assets. That was the catalyst. That was the moment Michael snapped. It wasn't greed. It was the realization that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how small he made himself, they would always reach into his pockets and take what was his. The theft of the $20,000 was a direct retaliation. It was an eye for an eye. I looked at Linda then. She had been quiet, letting Robert take the heat, playing the fragile mother. I asked her, Linda, you knew about the waitress, didn't you? She blinked, surprised that I had pivoted to her. She hesitated. I pressed her. My researchers spoke to your neighbor. You told your neighbor that Michael was seeing a trashy girl and you were going to put a stop to it. Did you know about Sarah? Linda's face hardened. The sweet grandmother mask dissolved into something much sharper. She said, that woman was using him. She was after our money. We had to intervene. So you intervened, I said, my voice rising, by confiscating his earnings, by stripping him of the means to make his own choices. Linda sat up straighter. We protected him from a mistake. Doctor, Phil, you don't understand. Michael is vulnerable. He doesn't read people well. If we hadn't stepped in, he would be in Ohio right now with no job and a woman who would leave him the second the money ran out. And instead, I countered. He is sitting on a national stage, labeled a felon, facing potential jail time, and hating you. Is this the better outcome? Is this success? She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Because in her mind, as long as he was in the house, even if he was in handcuffs, she had won. He was still within her orbit. This is a dynamic I see too often, but rarely this severe. It is called pathological enmeshment. The parent's identity is so wrapped up in being the caretakers of a troubled child that they subconsciously, or in this case, very consciously, sabotage any attempt the child makes to get better. If Michael succeeds, Robert and Linda become obsolete. If Michael leaves, who are they? They are just two lonely old people in a big house with a spreadsheet and no one to boss around. They needed his failure to feed their ego. I turned back to the audience to break down what we were seeing. Folks, you are watching a systematic dismantling of a human spirit. This man is 40 years old. He isn't addicted to drugs. He isn't violent. He isn't cognitively impaired, despite what his parents want you to believe. He is beaten down. This theft was a scream for help. I saw heads nodding in the audience. The tide had turned completely. The judgment was gone, replaced by horror. But I wasn't done with Robert. I needed to expose the extent of his sabotage. I pulled out a document from my folder. It was a police report from 2 years prior. "Robert," I said, holding up the paper, "tell me about the incident at the car dealership." Robert froze. He knew what was on that paper. Michael looked up, confused. He didn't know this part. I explained to Michael and the audience. 2 years ago, Michael had actually been approved for a car loan. He was going to buy a used sedan, something to get him to a job further away. The dealership called the house to verify his address. Robert answered the phone. According to the notes the finance manager put in the file which we obtained, Robert told the dealership that Michael was identity thefting him, that Michael had no income, and that if they sold him the car, he would sue the dealership. The loan was denied. Michael never knew why. He thought he just had bad credit. I handed the paper to Michael. "Your father killed the deal, Michael. He lied to keep you pedestrian. He lied to keep you grounded, literally and figuratively." Michael read the paper, his hands trembling so hard the paper rattled like a dry leaf. He looked at his father, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes turn into something else. It turned into betrayal, deep, agonizing betrayal. He whispered, You said the bank rejected me. You said I wasn't good enough." Robert didn't apologize. He doubled down. "You couldn't afford the payments, Michael. I saved you from bankruptcy. I was looking out for you." "You were looking out for yourself." I slammed my hand on the table, cutting through the noise. "You were making sure he couldn't drive away from you. This isn't protection, Robert. This is captivity. You have built a prison without bars, and you have gaslit this boy into thinking he deserves to be in it." The tension in the room was suffocating. We were at the tipping point. The facts were out. The ledger exposed their greed. The car loan exposed their sabotage. The confiscation of the tips exposed their cruelty. But we still had a problem. Michael was still a thief in the eyes of the law, and he was still psychologically a child in the presence of his parents. Knowing the truth and acting on it are two different things. I had stripped the parents naked in front of the world, but now I had to build Michael up enough to actually walk away, because I knew that the second the cameras cut, Robert and Linda would go into damage control mode. They would rewrite history before they even got to the parking lot. I needed a breakthrough, right here, right now. So we find ourselves at the edge of a cliff. We have exposed the lies. We have shown the ledger. We have proven the sabotage, but proof alone doesn't break chains that have been forged over 40 years. Michael was sitting there holding the evidence of his father's betrayal, staring at it like it was a foreign object. His entire reality was crumbling. The narrative that he was incompetent, that he was a financial risk, that he needed his parents to survive, it was all a fabrication. But when you have lived in a cage for 4 decades, the door swinging open is terrifying. The animal often runs back into the corner because the corner is known and the outside is chaos. I knew I had to act fast before the shock wore off and the old programming kicked back in. I stood up and walked over to Michael. I don't usually do this. I like to keep a professional distance, but this man needed a physical barrier between him and his parents. I stood between his chair and theirs, effectively blocking his view of them. I wanted him to look at me, only me. "Michael," I said, my voice low but firm, "look at me. Do not look at them. Look at me." He lifted his eyes. They were wet, filled with a mixture of grief and rage that he didn't know how to process. "You are not crazy," I told him. "You are not stupid, and you are not a criminal. You are a survivor of a 40-year hostage situation. But here is the hard truth, son. No one is coming to save you but you. I can expose them, I can shout the truth from the rooftops, but I cannot make you walk out that door. You have to decide right now if you are going to be a man or a pet." Behind me, I heard Linda start to sob. It was a theatrical, wailing sound designed to trigger Michael's guilt reflex. "How can you say that?" she cried. "After everything we've done, we fed him, we clothed him." I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes locked on Michael. "Do you hear that?" I asked him. "That is the sound of the hook trying to set itself back in your cheek. She isn't crying for you, Michael. She is crying because she is losing control. Don't take the bait." Michael's jaw tightened. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, fighting the instinct to comfort his mother, an instinct that had been beaten into him since he was a toddler. When he opened his eyes again, there was a clarity there I hadn't seen before. He looked past me directly at his father. "Why?" he asked. It wasn't a scream, it was a whisper, but it carried to the back of the room. "Why did you want me to fail?" Robert didn't shout this time. He looked at me, then at Michael, and realized the tough love act wasn't playing well anymore. He switched tactics. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, reasonable tone. "Michael, you're upset. We're all upset. Dr. Phil is twisting things for television. You know us. You know we love you. Come home, son. We'll forget the money. We'll tear up the ledger. Just come home, and we will work this out as a family." It was the ultimate offer. Amnesty, forgiveness, a return to the comfortable status quo. All Michael had to do was surrender, admit he was confused, and get back in the car. It was a devil's bargain. I stayed silent. I had to let Michael answer. If I answered for him, it would mean nothing. The studio was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Michael looked at his father, then at the ledger graphic, still frozen on the screen behind me, the itemized list of his worthlessness. "You'll tear up the ledger?" Michael repeated slowly. "Yes," Robert said, eager, thinking he had won. Gone, clean slate. "But you'll just start a new one tomorrow," Michael said. The realization hit him in real time. "You'll never let me be even. If I come home, I'm admitting I'm the problem, and I'm not the problem." He stood up. It was a shaky, uncoordinated movement, but he was on his feet. "I'm not coming home." The air left the room. Linda gasped. Robert's face turned a mottled purple. "You have nowhere to go," Robert shouted, abandoning the nice guy act instantly. "You have no money. You have a criminal record now. Who is going to take you? You think this show cares about you? You think that waitress wants a felon?" "I don't care," Michael said, his voice gaining strength. "I'd rather sleep under a bridge than in your house." This was the breakthrough. This was the moment the umbilical cord was severed. But a breakthrough without a plan is just a breakdown waiting to happen. I knew Robert was right about one thing. Michael had practical hurdles that were massive. He was facing legal charges for the theft. He had no assets. The reality of the world was about to hit him hard. I needed to equip him, and I needed to do it now. I turned to the cameras. All right, let's talk about the legal reality here. Michael committed a crime. I don't condone theft. You cannot steal your way to freedom. But the context matters. I looked at Robert. You filed a police report. The district attorney is involved. But here is what I am going to do. I have spoken to the DA in your county before the show. I showed them the evidence of financial abuse. I showed them the car loan sabotage. I showed them the ledger. And I told them that this show would provide legal counsel for Michael to argue coercion and duress. Robert looked like he had been slapped. "You can't do that!" "I can, and I did," I said. "Furthermore, if you pursue these charges, my team will assist Michael in filing a countersuit for 40 years of unpaid labor, emotional distress, and financial control. We will audit that joint account, Robert. We will find every penny of Michael's earnings that you managed into your own pockets. And I suspect the IRS might be interested in that ledger of yours as undeclared income." It was a bluff, mostly. I'm not a lawyer, and the IRS threat was a long shot. But bullies like Robert and Linda operate on fear. They are terrified of exposure. They are terrified of losing their standing in the community. The threat of a public, messy countersuit where their dirty laundry would be aired in court was their kryptonite. Robert slumped back in his chair. He looked at Linda. They exchanged a look of pure panic. The power dynamic had shifted completely. They were no longer the prosecutors, they were the defendants. "Drop the charges," I said. "Drop them today and give him his birth certificate, his social security card, and his personal effects, or prepare for a war you cannot win." Robert was silent for a long time. He looked at the audience, who were glaring at him with open hostility. He looked at Michael, who was standing tall, looking at me with gratitude. Finally, Robert gave a stiff, jerky nod. "Fine. If he wants to ruin his life, let him. We wash our hands of him." "Good," I said. "Consider them washed." I turned back to Michael. "Now, about where you are going to go. You are not going under a bridge. We have arranged for you to go to a dual diagnosis facility, not because you are an addict, but because you have severe trauma. You need a safe place to decompress, to learn how to manage your own finances, to learn who Michael is without Robert and Linda's voice in your head. It's a 90-day program. We are picking up the tab." Michael started to cry. Not the scared tears from the beginning of the show, but tears of relief. He looked at me and said, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I believe you," I said, "and millions of people watching believe you. You are starting over at 40, Michael. It's late, but it's not too late. Colonel Sanders didn't start KFC until he was 62. You have plenty of time." I walked him backstage myself. I didn't want his parents getting one last word in. As we walked down the hallway, away from the lights in the audience, I asked him one last question. "What is the first thing you are going to do when you get out of that program?" He thought about it for a second. He smiled. A genuine, crooked smile. "I'm going to open a bank account just in my name." "That's a good start," I said. "That's a very good start." Back on stage, I wrapped up the show. I looked into the camera for my final thought. Folks, there is a difference between parenting and ownership. We bring children into this world to raise them to leave us. That is the job. If you are holding on to your kids so tight that they can't breathe, you aren't loving them. You are consuming them. Let them go. Let them fail. Let them fly. Because if you don't, one day they will break the lock and they will never look back. And to all the Michaels out there, if you are in a cage with the door unlocked, push it open. The world is scary, but it's better than a cell. But the story didn't end there. Television is clean, real life is messy. 6 months later, I got an update on Michael. I wish I could tell you he was a millionaire living in a penthouse. He wasn't. But the truth is often more satisfying than a fairy tale. Real life doesn't wrap up in a 42-minute episode, and the damage of 4 decades doesn't vanish just because I gave a speech and paid for a rehab center. The road for Michael was rocky, to say the least. When he checked into the facility we sent him to, the first week was brutal. The staff told me he was like a soldier coming back from a war zone. He flinched at loud noises. He asked permission to use the bathroom. He hoarded food in his nightstand because he was subconsciously terrified that his privileges would be revoked if he misbehaved. That is the depth of the programming we were dealing with. He had to unlearn the instinct to be invisible. But about 3 weeks in, something shifted. We had him working with a therapist who specialized in coercive control, and for the first time, Michael started to get angry. Real anger. Not the petulant lashing out of a teenager, but the righteous indignation of a grown man who realizes he has been robbed of half his life. He called me once from the center guest, don't usually have my direct line, but I made an exception. He was furious. He said, Dr. Phil, I'm 40 years old and I don't know how to do laundry. I don't know how to file taxes. They crippled me. I listened. I let him vent. I told him, Michael, that anger is fuel. Use it. Don't let it burn you up. Let it drive the engine. You're playing catch up, so you better start running. When he got out of the program, the reality of his situation hit him hard. The amnesty with his parents held up. They dropped the charges, mostly because they were terrified of the public backlash after the episode aired, but they cut him off completely. No contact, no money, no access to his childhood belongings. He walked out of that facility with 2 duffel bags and a bus ticket. He didn't go to Ohio to find Sarah, the waitress. That relationship, fragile as it was, didn't survive the chaos. She had moved on. And frankly, Michael wasn't ready for a relationship. He needed to date himself first. He moved to a mid-sized town about 3 hours away from his parents. He got a job not as a manager or a professional, but as a night shift stalker at a grocery store. It was humble work, minimum wage, the kind of job his father would have sneered at. But for Michael, it was glorious. He told my producers that the first time he got a paycheck with his name on it, and only his name, he stared at it for 20 minutes. He went to the bank, opened that account he promised me, and deposited every cent. He lived in a rented room in a boarding house, eating ramen noodles and walking to work because he still didn't have a car. It wasn't glamorous. It was hard. There were nights he was lonely. There were nights he almost called home because the silence in his room was deafening compared to the constant noise of his parents' criticism. But he didn't call. He stuck it out. About 4 months after he settled in, a funny thing happened. His father, Robert, tried to reach out. It wasn't an apology, of course. It was a letter sent to the grocery store because Michael had blocked their numbers. The letter was classic Robert. It listed family news, mentioned how hard it was for his mother, and then subtly slipped in a line about how they had found some old savings bonds in Michael's name and he should come by to sign for them. It was the bait. It was the hook. They were trying to reel him back in with a financial carrot, just like they always had. Michael called me when he got the letter. What do I do? He asked. That money could buy me a car. I asked him, what is the price of that car, Michael? Is it $5,000 or is it your soul? Because if you walk back into that house, you are telling them that you can be bought. You are telling them that your freedom has a price tag. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you're right, burn the ships. He never responded to the letter. He left the money on the table. That was the moment he truly became an adult. Turning down free money when you are broke requires a level of discipline and self-respect that most people never have to muster. A year later, we did a follow-up show. I wanted the world to see what recovery actually looks like. It doesn't look like a makeover montage. It looks like a guy in a work uniform, tired but standing straight. Michael walked onto the stage. And the difference was subtle but profound. He wasn't slumped over. He wasn't shaking. He looked me in the eye and shook my hand with a grip that had some life in it. He told the audience about his life. He had been promoted to shift supervisor at the grocery store. He had bought a used Honda with his own money at an exorbitant interest rate because he had no credit history, but it was his. He had a girlfriend, a nice woman who worked at a library, and they were taking it slow. He was going to community college at night to get a certification in HVAC repair because he wanted to trade. He was building a life brick by brick. I asked him about his parents. He said, "I don't hate them anymore, Dr. Phil. I pity them. They are stuck in that house with their anger and their spreadsheet, and I'm out here living. They are the ones in prison, not me." That was a profound insight. It showed a level of emotional maturity that, frankly, many people never reach. He had realized that forgiveness isn't about letting the other person off the hook. It's about cutting the anchor so you can sail away. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't verify. We had sent a private investigator to check on Robert and Linda just to see if the monster had really gone back into the cave. What we found was sad, but predictable. They had joined a support group for estranged parents. They were telling anyone who would listen that their son had been brainwashed by a Hollywood cult, that's me, and that he was on drugs. They had rewritten the narrative completely to protect their egos. They hadn't learned a thing. And that is the tragedy of people like Robert and Linda. They would rather be right than be happy. They would rather be victims than be parents. I showed Michael the footage of his parents at the support group meeting. I watched his face closely. I expected him to be angry, maybe hurt. Instead, he just shrugged. "Let them talk," he said. "That's their story. I have my own story now." And that right there is the victory. The moment you stop caring about the narrative your abuser is spinning is the moment they lose all power over you. We ended that follow-up show with a surprise for Michael. We had contacted the HVAC trade school he was attending. We paid his tuition in full for the next 2 years, not as a handout, but as an investment, because a man who fights that hard for his freedom deserves a little wind in his sails. When we told him, he broke down again, but this time he let himself be hugged. He let himself receive kindness without looking for the strings attached. That was the biggest change of all. He had learned to trust again. So, why does this story stick with me? Why do I tell it now? Because there are thousands of Michaels out there, maybe not 40 years old, maybe not stealing from safes, but stuck in that same web of guilt, obligation, and financial control. They are told that they owe their parents for their existence. They are told that setting boundaries is betrayal. They are gaslit into believing they are incapable of surviving on their own. And to those people, I say this. Look at Michael. He was 40, broke, and terrified. He was labeled a criminal. He had every reason to fold, but he didn't. He walked through the fire and came out the other side forged. It wasn't easy. It wasn't pretty. He ate a lot of ramen noodles and spent a lot of lonely nights staring at the ceiling. But he owns his life now. He owns his mistakes, and he owns his victories. And no one, not his father, not a ledger, not a bank account, can ever take that away from him. Sometimes the hardest theft you ever have to commit is stealing your own life back from the people who claim to love you the most. But let me tell you, folks, it is the only crime that pays, and in Michael's case, the verdict was clear. Not guilty, just free. You know, when the cameras stop rolling and the studio lights dim, that is when the real work begins. We often think of these stories as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. But life is a continuum. For Michael, that follow-up show was a high point, a public validation of his struggle. But what happens when the applause fades? What happens 5 years down the line? I always say that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, but trauma recovery disrupts that predictability. It introduces a new variable, resilience. I kept tabs on Michael because his case was one of those litmus tests for my entire philosophy. If you can take a man who has been infantilized for 4 decades and turn him into a functioning, autonomous adult, then there is hope for anyone. If he slides back, then we have to ask ourselves some hard questions about the permanence of psychological scars. 5 years after that first taping, I received an email. It wasn't from Michael, it was from a woman named Sarah. Not the waitress from the diner that chapter had closed long ago, but his wife. Yes, wife. The librarian he had been dating had stuck around. They had gotten married in a small ceremony at a courthouse, followed by a reception in their backyard. She sent me a photo. Michael looked older, grayer, but solid. He was wearing a suit that fit him properly. He was smiling, and his arm was around her waist in a way that showed confidence, not dependency. But the email wasn't just a happy update. It had a question. Doctor, Phil, she wrote, Michael's father passed away last week. His mother is alone and demanding that Michael come handle the estate. He is torn. He feels he owes her nothing, but he also feels a pull to go back and close the book. He asked me to ask you, is it safe? I picked up the phone. I don't do that often, but the stakes were high. A funeral is the classic trap for estranged families. It uses grief and social convention to force proximity, and proximity is all an abuser needs to reestablish control. I called Michael. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but welcoming. His voice was deeper, more resonant. The shy mumble was gone. I hear Robert passed, I said. I'm sorry for your loss, whatever that loss looks like to you. Ideally, it feels like relief, Michael said honestly. Is that bad? It's honest, I told him. Feelings aren't good or bad, they just are. But let's talk about your mother. She wants you to come back to handle the estate. Why? She says she can't do it. She says she's too frail. She says she needs the man of the house. I let that hang in the air. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman who spent 40 years telling him he wasn't a man was now invoking his manhood to serve her needs. Michael, you are a licensed HVAC technician now. You run a crew, right? Yeah? I have 3 guys under me. So you know how to spot a system failure, I said. You know when a compressor is shot and just making noise. Your mother is that compressor. She isn't calling you because she respects you. She is calling you because the other half of her control system, your father, is gone and she needs a replacement part. If you go back there, you aren't going as an executor, you are going as a recruit. So I don't go? You can go. I said, but you go on your terms. You don't stay in the house. You stay in a hotel. You don't go alone. You take Sarah and you set a time limit. You give it 3 days. If she starts the guilt trip, if she brings up the ledger, if she criticizes your wife, you walk. You have the keys to the car now, Michael. You can drive away anytime you want. He did go, and it played out exactly as we feared, but with a different ending. He went back to that house, the museum of his misery. He told me later that walking into his old bedroom was like walking into a time capsule. Nothing had changed. The same posters, the same twin bed. It was a shrine to his arrested development. Linda tried to play the grieving widow card. She wept, she clung to him, but then on the second day, she asked him to sign a paper. It was a transfer of the house deed, putting it in his name, but with a clause that she retained life estate, meaning she could live there forever and he would be responsible for the taxes and maintenance. It was the ultimate shackle. She wanted to tie him to the property financially, ensuring he could never leave again without abandoning her to homelessness. Old Michael might have signed it out of guilt. New Michael read the document. He handed it back. "No, Mom," he said. "I have my own house. I have my own bills. I can't take this on." She exploded. The grief vanished, replaced by the rage I had seen on my stage 5 years prior. She screamed that he was ungrateful, that he was a thief, bringing up the old hit, that he was abandoning her, and Michael, he just stood there. He didn't yell back. He didn't cower. He waited for her to finish. Then he said, "I'm sorry you feel that way. Sarah and I are leaving now." And he did. He walked out the front door, got in his car, and drove back to his life. He didn't look back. He realized that the closure he was looking for wasn't something his mother could give him. Closure isn't a conversation, it's a decision. It's the decision to stop knocking on a door that will never open to the person you are today. That was the last test. He passed. Today, Michael is boring, and I mean that as the highest compliment. He pays his taxes, he mows his lawn, he argues with his wife about what to watch on Netflix, he worries about his cholesterol. He is wonderfully, beautifully mundane. He is living the life that was stolen from him for 40 years, and he is savoring every unremarkable minute of it. He isn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't save the world, but he saved himself. And in a world that loves to victim blame, that loves to look at a 40-year-old man living at home and call him a loser, Michael is proof that you never really know what battles are being fought behind closed doors. He taught me something too. He reminded me that the human spirit is like a coil. You can press it down, you can weigh it down with decades of abuse and lies, but the potential energy remains. All it needs is a moment, a catalyst, a theft, a television show to spring back. Michael sprung back. So when people ask me about the Dr. Phil outcome, about whether people really change, I tell them about the man who stole from his parents to buy his freedom. I tell them that sometimes you have to do the wrong thing to make things right. I tell them that it's never too late to grow up, and most importantly, I tell them that no matter how deep the hole is, there is always a ladder. You just have to be brave enough to climb it, one shaky step at a time. That is the story. No magic, just work. And that is the only kind of ending that sticks.